3 days before the grand opening of a luxury auto showroom next to my farm, I watched a salesman standing ankle-deep in muddy water inside a glass lobby that had cost millions of dollars to build. And while he was screaming into his phone and customers were running for higher ground, I was sitting on my tractor nearly half a mile away wondering how a man with so much money could know so little about the land underneath his own building. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has worked the same 40 acres outside a small Midwestern town for longer than most people can remember. We aren't rich, we don't drive fancy trucks, and nobody is putting our farm in a magazine. But we know every ditch, every fence line, every low spot where rainwater likes to gather, and most importantly, we know the irrigation canal that cuts across the property. That canal isn't just a trench full of water. Around here, it's survival. My grandfather helped maintain it decades ago. My father depended on it, and now I do too. Without it, my corn and soybean fields would start suffering within days during a hot summer stretch. So imagine my surprise when I pulled up one Tuesday morning and saw something that nearly made me drive straight through my own fence. The canal was gone. Well, technically it was still there, but a giant dirt berm had been pushed directly across it. Bulldozers had piled up tons of soil, concrete pipes had been installed, and the water that normally flowed through my property had been diverted somewhere else. At first I honestly thought there had been some kind of emergency project by the county. Then I followed the redirected flow and discovered exactly where my water was going. Right next door stood a brand new luxury auto showroom owned by a developer named Gavin Sterling. The place looked like something dropped in from another planet. Huge glass walls, polished stone walkways, imported landscaping, decorative fountains, and enough chrome to blind a person on a sunny day. And there, feeding a decorative pond beside the showroom entrance, was the water that used to irrigate my fields. I got out of my truck so fast I nearly left the door open. Construction crews were still working nearby, and I marched straight toward the foreman. "What exactly is this?" I asked. The man barely looked up. He reached into a folder, handed me a document, and said, "The new owner secured access rights to adjacent drainage infrastructure. Water has been redirected for development purposes." Development purposes. That's the kind of phrase people use when they want something to sound legal without actually explaining anything. I looked at my nearly dry canal, then at the pond sparkling beside a row of luxury SUVs, and I felt my blood pressure shoot through the roof. They had taken water from active farmland so wealthy customers could admire fake waterfalls while shopping for six-figure vehicles. That afternoon, I called Gavin directly. I'd never met him before, but I knew exactly who he was. Everybody in town did. He was one of those developers who walked into a room like he personally invented success. The second he answered, I explained the situation. He didn't apologize. He didn't even pretend to care. Instead, he laughed. Actually laughed. Then he said, "Ethan, your little farm ditch doesn't exactly fit the image we're building over here. We're bringing growth to this town. Maybe it's time for you guys to modernize." I remember staring at my phone in disbelief. Modernize? That's what he called stealing irrigation water from working farmland. The next day things got worse. Temperatures climbed into the 90s, and sections of my western field were already showing signs of stress. Leaves were curling. Soil was drying. Crops that represented months of work were beginning to suffer because somebody in an expensive suit wanted prettier landscaping. Most people would have hired a lawyer immediately. Some people would have lost their temper and done something stupid. But I didn't do either one. Instead, I started studying the situation. See, there was something Gavin didn't know. The irrigation system around our area wasn't designed by developers. It was designed by farmers and engineers back in the 1940s. And old systems have memories. They have backup routes, overflow channels, and emergency drainage paths that don't show up on flashy presentation boards. While Gavin was admiring fountains and marble floors, I was walking fence lines and checking old maps. The more I looked, the more I realized something important. By blocking the canal, he hadn't solved a water problem. He had created one. A very large one. And unlike Gavin, I knew exactly where that problem was eventually going to end up. Now before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand situations like this. According to standard procedure, you generally can't just alter a long-established agricultural water system because it happens to be inconvenient for a new development project. Water rights, drainage routes, and irrigation infrastructure usually involve layers of regulations that existed long before the newest guy with a construction budget showed up. From a legal perspective, the biggest mistake isn't always taking the water itself. Sometimes it's interfering with the natural flow and creating damage somewhere else. And honestly, this is a psychological trap a lot of powerful people fall into. When somebody spends millions building something flashy, they start believing money automatically outranks experience. Gavin looked at maps, permits, and architectural renderings. I looked at 40 years of walking that land. That's a completely different kind of knowledge. The lesson here is that confidence can be useful, but arrogance has a way of hiding critical details. And in this case, one very expensive detail was about to reveal itself. The morning after that phone call, I pulled an old county drainage map out of a filing cabinet in my barn. The paper was yellow around the edges and smelled like dust and diesel fuel, but it showed something Gavin's expensive consultants apparently never bothered to investigate. Decades earlier, engineers had built an overflow trench that ran along the northern edge of my property. Most of the year it sat nearly empty, looking like nothing more than a shallow ditch covered with grass and weeds. But during periods of heavy irrigation flow, excess water automatically spilled into that channel and traveled downhill toward a natural drainage basin. Back when the system was designed, there hadn't been any buildings in that area, just open ground. Now there was a multi-million-dollar showroom sitting right in the middle of it. I spent the rest of the day inspecting every section of the canal network. The more I checked, the clearer the situation became. Gavin's dirt barrier wasn't simply diverting water. It was creating pressure throughout the entire system. Water that should have been flowing naturally through my fields was backing up farther and farther upstream. The canal was essentially becoming a giant reservoir with nowhere to release its excess volume. By late afternoon, I knew exactly what would happen eventually. The only question was when. Then Mother Nature helped move the timeline forward. The local irrigation district announced a scheduled high-volume release from upstream reservoirs. Farmers throughout the region needed additional water because of the summer heat wave. The moment I heard the announcement, I almost laughed. Gavin had unknowingly picked the absolute worst week possible to interfere with the canal. The next morning, water levels started rising quickly. By noon, the backed-up section behind the dirt berm was noticeably higher than normal. I stood near the old steel floodgate along the northern edge of my property and watched the current pushing against decades-old concrete walls. The gate wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. It was part of the original system. It existed specifically for situations where excess water needed somewhere to go. Around sunset, I made a simple decision. I opened it. That's it. No explosives. No sabotage. No trespassing. No damage. I simply activated infrastructure that had existed longer than Gavin had probably been alive. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The water hesitated as if considering its options. Then the pressure finally won. A surge of water rushed through the overflow trench with enough force to flatten weeds and small brush along its path. Within 20 minutes, a steady stream was moving downhill. Within 45 minutes, it looked like a river. I drove my tractor to a ridge overlooking both properties and waited. The first signs appeared in the showroom parking lot. Water began pooling near decorative flower beds. Employees came outside and looked confused. Then the flow increased. The shallow pools merged together and spread across the asphalt. Landscaping mulch floated away. Decorative rocks shifted. Expensive shrubs disappeared beneath muddy water. By that point, several customers were already moving their vehicles. An hour later, panic started setting in. The parking lot resembled a swamp. Water rolled across the pavement in wide sheets and surrounded rows of luxury vehicles. Employees ran back and forth carrying sandbags while managers shouted instructions nobody could hear over the chaos. But the real problem wasn't outside. The real problem was the building itself. Gavin's architects had designed the showroom with a sunken glass lobby because it looked sleek and modern. Visitors entered by walking slightly downward from the surrounding landscape. It was visually impressive. It was also a terrible idea for a structure located directly below a historical drainage route. The moment the rising water reached the entrance, gravity took over. Water slipped beneath door seals. Then it poured through. What started as a trickle became a steady stream. Then a flood. Through the giant glass walls, I could see employees scrambling across polished marble floors. Chairs floated. Promotional displays tipped over. People grabbed mops and buckets like they were trying to stop a hurricane with kitchen utensils. One salesman actually climbed onto the hood of a sports car to avoid getting his shoes wet. I wish I could say I felt sorry for them. I didn't. Not after watching my crops begin to suffer, because somebody thought aesthetics mattered more than agriculture. By full dark, emergency crews had arrived. Pumps were deployed. Barricades went up. Flashing lights illuminated the entire property. The grand opening celebration that Gavin had spent months advertising was transforming into a public relations disaster visible from half the county. The next morning, things got even better. News of the flooding spread quickly through town. Farmers heard about it. Business owners heard about it. County officials heard about it. And eventually, Gavin heard about me watching everything from my tractor. Around mid-morning, I saw a black luxury SUV tearing down the gravel road toward my barn. It stopped so abruptly that dust covered half the vehicle. Gavin jumped out before the engine even shut off. His designer suit was wrinkled. His expensive shoes were covered in mud. He looked like a man who had just discovered money couldn't solve every problem. "You flooded my property," he shouted while marching across my yard. "Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused?" I leaned against my tractor and let him finish. Then I reached into the cab and pulled out the county drainage map. "Actually," I said, "you flooded your own property." His face turned red instantly. "Don't play games with me." I unfolded the map and pointed toward the canal system. "This overflow route existed decades before your showroom. You blocked the primary channel. Water followed the alternate route exactly as designed." He stared at the map without saying a word. For the first time since we'd met, he looked uncertain. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "My attorneys will destroy you." I almost laughed. "Maybe," I said, "but county engineers are probably going to have questions first." As it turned out, they had plenty. Inspectors arrived the following morning. Survey crews followed shortly afterward. They examined the dirt berm, measured water flow patterns, reviewed permits, and studied historical records. The investigation didn't take long. According to standard procedure, modifications affecting agricultural water infrastructure require extensive review and approval. Gavin either ignored those requirements or assumed nobody would challenge him. Either way, the findings weren't good. From a legal perspective, the evidence was overwhelming. His project had obstructed a functioning irrigation system, interfered with established drainage routes, and contributed directly to both agricultural and property damage. The county issued citations, then more citations, then fines, lots of fines. He was ordered to remove the obstruction immediately. He was ordered to restore the canal. He was ordered to compensate affected agricultural losses. He was even held responsible for portions of the cleanup costs associated with the flooding event. Watching all of this unfold was strangely satisfying because nobody had to bend the rules. Nobody had to seek revenge. Reality handled everything. A week later, heavy machinery returned to the site. This time the excavators weren't building something. They were tearing Gavin's dirt wall apart piece by piece. I stood near the property line while operators removed the obstruction and restored the canal to its original condition. The moment the water began flowing normally again, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. My fields recovered. The irrigation system stabilized. The crops that remained healthy continued growing. Meanwhile, Gavin spent weeks dealing with repairs, inspections, insurance claims, angry investors, and a reputation that wasn't nearly as polished as his marble floors used to be. And every single part of it started because one man believed he understood the land better than the people who had spent their entire lives living on it. A few months after everything settled down, life on the farm looked pretty normal again. The canal flowed the way it always had. My corn stood tall across the western field, and the soybean rows filled in so thick you could barely see the soil between them. If you drove past my property today, you probably wouldn't notice anything unusual. That's the funny thing about land. Given enough time, it tends to heal itself. The same can't always be said for people. Every now and then I still drive past that showroom on my way into town. The glass walls are still there. The luxury vehicles are still lined up under bright lights. But some of the flashy landscaping never came back. The oversized decorative pond was scaled down. The fountain system runs less often. And every time I see it, I'm reminded of something important. The conflict was never really about water. Water was just the trigger. The real issue was respect. Gavin looked at the farm and saw an obstacle. He saw old infrastructure, old traditions, and people he assumed were standing in the way of progress. What he failed to understand was that progress and respect aren't enemies. New development can coexist with existing communities. Growth can happen without bulldozing the people who were there first. The problem begins when somebody believes their money automatically gives them authority over everyone else. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere, not just in land disputes. People start confusing resources with wisdom. They assume success in one area makes them experts in every area. And sometimes life has a very direct way of correcting that assumption. According to standard procedure, systems exist for a reason. Whether we're talking about irrigation networks, property boundaries, environmental protections, or community agreements, those rules were usually created because somebody learned a difficult lesson long ago. When people ignore those systems because they think they're smarter than everyone else, the consequences often arrive in ways they never expect. From a legal perspective, one of the biggest mistakes property owners make is assuming ownership means unlimited control. It doesn't. Rights come with responsibilities. Land comes with history. Infrastructure comes with obligations. And if you interfere with something that affects neighboring properties, the law tends to take a very serious interest in your decisions. What fascinates me most is how avoidable this entire situation was. Gavin could have walked across the property line on day one and introduced himself. He could have asked questions. He could have consulted local farmers who understood the drainage system better than any consultant from out of town. He could have spent a few hours learning instead of assuming. Chances are we would have found a solution together. Instead, he chose arrogance over communication, and that decision became incredibly expensive. The lesson here is that local knowledge matters. Experience matters. Listening matters. You don't have to agree with everybody, but dismissing people simply because they live differently than you do is usually a mistake. Sometimes the guy driving the old tractor knows something the guy driving the luxury SUV doesn't. And sometimes that knowledge is worth a whole lot more than people realize. Looking back, I never wanted revenge. I didn't wake up one morning hoping a showroom would flood. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my water back. I wanted my farm protected. I wanted the same respect my family had shown that land for generations. Everything that happened afterward was simply the result of choices Gavin made himself. Nature didn't pick sides. Gravity didn't pick sides. Water didn't pick sides. They all just followed the path that existed. And that's probably the biggest takeaway from this entire story. Actions create consequences, even when we don't see them immediately. The shortcuts we take today often become the problems we face tomorrow. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled things differently? Should Gavin have faced even stronger penalties? Or do you think the flooding itself was lesson enough? And here's the question that always starts arguments whenever I tell this story around town. When someone ignores local knowledge and causes their own disaster, is that bad luck? Or is it justice finally catching up? Let me know what you think in the comments because I genuinely love to hear both sides of that debate.